Hello and welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast, Minnesota's best weekly breakdown of political news inside and outside the Capitol. I'm your host, Jeremy Munson, a former state representative here from southern Minnesota. And as usual, we're joined by State Representative Walter Hudson of District 30A. We've had a lot of bills that have passed the House floor, more bills being introduced. We've got gun bills coming up in the Public Safety Committee this Friday. All the talk the Democrats say, we're not coming for your guns, we're not coming for your guns, don't worry, you're overreacting. We're no longer overreacting. Everything we thought was going to come true is coming true. They're going to be introducing and passing red flag legislation, that, absolute breakdown of due process. They're going to be banning guns and products that shouldn't be banned. And we've looked to other states like Illinois, where the Supreme Court has upheld of the Second Amendment, but Tim Walz is plowing ahead anyways on this gun legislation. Walter, we had a little discussion offline about a couple of bills that we wanted to cover. Lee Finke, state representative, the new freshman who is a transgender, introduced some rather radical legislation earlier in the session, and it didn't get a lot of press. One of these bills is House File 267 that changes part of legislation that has to do with the transfer of a communicable disease. You want to break this bill down for us? Because I think people should be concerned about this bill passing. And it, of course, certainly shows just how radical the Democrats are.
Yeah, so when this was relatively early in the session when this bill was introduced, and when they introduce bills, as you well know, Jeremy, we get a list of like the summary of what the bill does. And in this case, the summary of what the bill does is, and I quote because I'm reading directly from it, a bill relating to crime, repealing the crime of the transfer of an infectious agent for a communicable disease from one person who knowingly harbors the agent to another. And so you read that language and your mind immediately goes to the transmission of HIV or AIDS, right? That's what this is presumably targeted at repealing is the transmission of AIDS knowingly from one person to another being a crime. And so those were the terms in which we were thinking about it and talking about it. And even just on that basis, it's horrendous, right? The idea that somebody who is HIV positive or suffering from AIDS and knows that that's the case is going to engage in behavior, sexual conduct, that or otherwise. I mean, I suppose you could inject somebody, knowingly transmit that disease to somebody else, right? That's just complete. That should be a crime. That is an assault on someone's body to do that. But the counter argument was, and as I discussed this with some people and even some members, the counter argument was, well, a lot has changed since the 1980s. HIV isn't the same disease that it once was. There's been tremendous advances and strides in treatment that makes it much less lethal and much more chronic and something that you're able to live with persistently and indefinitely than it ever was before. It's another way of putting it is it's not as big of a deal as it used to be. And so we and there's been no movement, by the way, on this that I'm aware of in the legislature. I don't see this bill getting a hearing. I mean, maybe it will, but I think that'll be very nuts if it does, especially after what we're about to disclose here. But that was kind of fell by the wayside, right? Because that's part of the thing that's going on here at the Capitol is things are happening so quickly and it's such rapid fire that you don't have time to react. You don't have time to really dig down into the details and see what it is that they're actually proposing. And so this has kind of fallen away as something that we haven't really been thinking about or looking at, not taking seriously because it's not moving through committees. It's not something that people are talking about. Well, you and I in casual conversation here before the show started talking about it. And so I looked up the actual bill. And all the bill does is it just repeals a section of law. It repeals a section of Minnesota statutes, section 609.2241. So what is that? Well, you Google it and it pops up. 609.2241 is a section of law that deals with the knowing transfer of communicable diseases. Now, I'm going to read this to you, okay? And bear with me because it's very important to understand what's going on here. The definition of a communicable disease means a disease or condition that causes serious illness, serious disability, or death. The infectious agent of which may pass or be carried from the body of one person to the body of another through direct transmission. And then it goes on to define direct transmission. Means predominantly sexual or blood-borne transmission. Okay. And then a person who knowingly harbors an infectious agent is defined as a person who receives from a physician or other health professional advice that the person harbors an infectious agent for a communicable disease, educational information about behavior which might transmit the infectious agent, and instruction of practical means of preventing such transmission. So what we're talking about here is we're talking about somebody who has been informed from a health professional that they have a communicable disease, how it's transmitted, and practical instruction on how to prevent such means of transmission. Okay, so that's the person who this statute is directed against. Somebody who knows that they have an infectious disease that causes serious illness, serious disability, or death. All right, and it goes on to make it a crime for one person who knowingly harbors an infectious agent to transfer that infectious agent to someone else. And so the argument that HIV is highly treatable now and it's not that big of a deal, if that were true, if it were true that HIV is not a big deal in 2023, then by my reading, this statute wouldn't apply. Because to me, not a big deal is less than serious illness, serious disability, or death, right? That's what this statute covers. This statute covers somebody who has an infectious disease that is known to cause serious illness, serious disability, or death, and then knowingly transmits that to another person. If HIV doesn't fall into that category, then this statute doesn't apply. So why would you want to repeal it?
Yeah, and it's important also that the transfer of this, because I read the bill, I got wound up about it because I thought it was just so egregious to remove this part of our law. And then I started thinking, well, let me put my other hat on here and say, well, what if this would apply to COVID? Could this apply to COVID? And you read through it, and because it isn't transferred by blood or sexual transmission, when we talk about the crime, the crime is actually sharing of non-sterile syringes or needles for the purpose of injecting drugs, the transfer of blood, sperm, sexual penetration with another person without having first informed the other person that you have a communicable disease. So that doesn't apply to COVID. This was written specific for HIV or for other very serious diseases. And this is a time where affirmative consent has been taught for a generation, where everything is affirmed before you have consenting sex. This is removing this as a crime, and it's really I think a step way too far.
Yeah, no doubt. And like I say, you can't give these people the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's what even I and a lot of our other members did when we first saw this bill. Is at first we were horrified just at the premise, but then we kind of thought about it and tried to give Representative Finke the benefit of the doubt that there might be some good motive here. But by a plain reading of the statute that the representative is attempting to repeal, I can't conceive of a good motive for this. I don't understand why you would want to be able to willfully transmit a infectious disease that's known to cause serious illness, serious disability, or death.
Well, another bill that the same author, Finke, wrote has to do with creating a safe state for people to bring their children to have gender transition, to get them sterilized, to inject them with hormones and puberty blockers from if they live in a state that is working through the process of banning such a practice, right? We have legislation in Minnesota being heard by the left that will ban people from having conversations with children who are questioning their sexuality, right? This idea that if you're a parent of a child that thinks they're gay and you want to bring them to seek counseling, it's going to be illegal for that counselor to have a conversation that might put that child back into the gender that they were born in or the sexual orientation in one way or another. And in this bill is going to, if passed, would allow a mother in North Dakota to kidnap her own child and bring them across state lines to have that child sterilized against the wishes of the father. And this would create a court case where the father's, wanting their child to not have their gender transitioned, right? Have surgery or whatever. And this is basically writing the legislation, writing law for the courts to look at to say, nope, this is the law in Minnesota that we're not going to deal with any courts from another state trying to stop this from happening. This is going to be a state to kidnap your child and bring them to transition them against the will of, well, actually, it could be against the will of both parents. It could be someone else, a teacher or somebody kidnapping a child and bringing them here. This is going to be pretty bold legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that last part, whether it could be somebody who isn't a parent based upon what I'm reading here in the bill. It says that a law of another state that authorizes a state agency to remove a child from the child's parent or guardian because the parent or guardian allowed the child to receive gender affirming health care as defined in such and whereforth is against the public policy of this state and must not be enforced or applied. So it seems to be tailored very much at intervening in child custody cases where the basis of the custody dispute in the state where the child is being transported from has something to do with gender identity and gender affirming care. But regardless, no matter which way you cut it, or how precise or targeted the policy is, this is quite literally this is what I'm about to say is going to sound like exaggerated political rhetoric. And this is the biggest problem that I've had so far as a legislator, is that every time I tell people what the Democrats are doing, they don't believe me and they assume I must be exaggerating because it's so outrageous and absurd and obscene that it seems as though I must be exaggerating. But what I'm about to say is 100% factually correct. Okay. This is the kidnap to poison and mutilate bill. That's what this is. This is a bill that would enable, as Jeremy indicates, one parent to literally kidnap their child from the other parent, bring them across state lines to Minnesota for the purposes of poisoning and mutilating and sterilizing that child. That's what this bill enables. There are no words. And that's another thing that I found myself saying multiple times in just 1 month of this legislative session in Minnesota. Some words that come close, the words that come the closest would be things like reprehensible, abhorrent, obscene, scandalous, satanic. I mean, go down the Rolodex of all the worst adjectives you could apply to a given policy, and they're inadequate to describe what this bill does. I think you might be muted, Jeremy.
Yeah, sorry. The way that you read the bill, it looks like it's written to prevent a court order from another state to remove that child from the custody of their parents, because some states may believe that it's child abuse to subject their child to, sterilization or mutilation. But I do believe that if a child in another state whose parents did not support them transitioning escaped to Minnesota with an adult, whether it be their teacher or a counselor at school or some other adult, that if that went to court, this type of legislation would be extended to apply to give that child the ability to, what do you call that, when they become an adult? Emancipation from their parents or everything else. I mean, it would be a court case. Minnesota is trying to make themselves this haven for mutilating children. This is the same state that wouldn't ban mutilation of children, female circumcision. It's just appalling. But this comes back to parental rights. I mean, we're not talking about whether or not a child thinks they're another gender and to let them wear different outfits at school. We're talking about chemical, permanently altering a child.
Yes.
Blocking puberty from happening, physically altering their body, sterilizing them for life, which the legislature just passed as a right of all people, not adults, but to children too. The legislation passed last year, the PRO Act, gives every person the right to choose their sterilization. And this legislation, I mean, they set the groundwork for these bills to now apply more broadly than you can even interpret it on its own. In fact, on the House floor and in the Senate, when they talked about legislation that's also in the pipe to pass, the Democrats were quick to stand up and to try to narrow the scope of the debate to only the bill on the floor. It's hard to look at the bill being debated when you know that the bills waiting in the wings will work to expand that, right?
Correct.
If this bill passes now, look at what is going to be applied. And those 5 different pieces that they're trying to pass separately, when put together, create legislatively. I mean, it's going to be just the state will be absolutely radical.
Yeah, I mean, look, and again, I run into this problem of the more accurate I am in describing what's taking place, the less plausible it sounds, because that's how radical and extreme and obscene this Democrat governing majority of Minnesota is. This has been the destroy, kill, and mutilate children session so far in 2023. I mean, their first bill was a bill to literally destroy human life, to kill unborn and born children. And they've got another bill coming through the pipe, House File 91, that will repeal the feeble remaining restrictions on things like providing medical care to a baby that's been born alive in the process of a botched abortion. I mean, this is how they started off with their first legislative proposal. They started off with a declaration of war against life itself and against children in particular. And this is a furtherance of that. They're saying to the extent that children are allowed to exist in the first place, we are going to enable, to the greatest extent the Overton window allows us, the ability of those children to be corrupted, maimed, defaced, and destroyed as early as possible, but whenever we can get to them. You are dealing with, I keep telling people, this is the heart of darkness. This is a pit of evil. This is an abyss that I find myself navigating down here in St. Paul. And none of those terms are even adequate to describe it. The depth of evil that is governing this place is unfathomable. And at this point, it really is in the hands of God to stop these people. And maybe he won't, as judgment against us, because we allowed it to happen.
Yeah. What else is missing from this equation is the media. And we've talked about this briefly too. I mean, look, I grew up in a liberal household, got involved in politics in college, and I always heard this term liberal media. And I grew up on Minnesota Public Radio News, and I listened to MSNBC and both sides of the debate all the time. And only after entering politics did I really understand how biased the media is. And when you have legislation like the driver's license for all bill that was passed on the House floor, and you and I have debated a little bit about this, but not differentiating between immigrants and illegal immigrants, right? Lawful immigrants and unlawful immigrants is a really big deal. And the media doesn't report the facts, or they leave out certain parts of bills that are so important to understand for the public should be understanding. Or when they passed the PRO Act, it was they codified Roe. They didn't codify Roe, right? Roe had limitations, especially when it came to viability of the child, and
100%.
they're not reporting accurately, and it's so egregious. They have to knowingly be doing this. And so if the media were to actually report both sides of the debate, instead of having just the rhino Tolkien Republican on their roundtable that isn't a conservative, the public isn't getting the real information, and it's a real disservice to the public. But that is part of why the Democrats can march through this legislation and others so quickly, is because, first of all, if they turn on the fire hose, the media can't report on everything anyways. And so a lot of the stuff like Finke's bills are going to be attached to the omnibus bills and crammed through. But but for these important bills, they should be digging into the detail we are and actually running scenarios through to understand, what does this really mean? What would this allow?
Right.
And if you can, when this comes through committee, the bill we just spoke about, we should be adding amendments onto that bill to say, look, if both parents bring a child here, that would be in this bill. But if one parent brings a child here and the other one doesn't, or if a child is trying to be emancipated from their parents, this is a big issue and this shouldn't apply here. And the Democrats will probably jump at it and say, well, that doesn't happen, or just like they did with the PRO Act, saying late-term abortions don't happen, and they didn't want to make it illegal. Well, you should be putting guardrails on these bills as they come through committees and really calling them out. And it's because there's so much legislation coming through. It's difficult for our side of the aisle to do the research, to write the amendments, to draft them, and to speak to them, but it needs to happen everywhere on this legislation.
Yeah, I mean, at least half of what I'm doing in terms of legislative work is not directly dealing with legislation. It's being a reporter. That's what I'm doing. I'm doing things like this. I'm doing things like the Omnibus podcast. I'm putting out my own videos and blurbs on Twitter and Facebook. I'm getting the word out on things that are going on down here, analyzing bills and what. I'm doing the work that a reporter should be doing. Yesterday, I walked down to the Capitol. There was a press conference for, I believe the group is called Violence Free Minnesota. It's a domestic violence advocacy group. And they were having a big press conference down here in the basement press conference room. And I had never been over on that side of the basement before. And so I didn't quite know how to navigate. And I ended up going down the hallway where all of the press offices are. Right. So you've got, Star Tribune, you've got, NPR, you've got every mainstream press agency has an office here at the Capitol in the basement. And so I'm walking past them all. And as I'm walking past, I'm glancing in them and I'm seeing people in there doing stuff, TV monitors, computers. And I'm thinking to myself, what the hell are these people doing? What are they writing about? What are they spending their time with? Because they're not interested in any of the things that are actually going on. They're not reporting on any of the stuff that I've been breaking 24/7 since the session started. Really impactful. I mean, stories that would get clicks, right? Like Representative Gomez, maybe we'll talk about this later. Representative Gomez on the House floor in pitching her driver's licenses for all, quote unquote, bill, explicitly saying that the content of the bill was determined by, quote, the community, unquote. And our members get up and ask her, whoa, 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 what are you talking? Which community? You need to tell me who these people are who are deciding the content of legislation before it comes to the House floor. And then your argument is we need to defer to this extra legislative process that took place without those of us who have election certificates to determine what the content of this bill is going to be. That's a story, okay? You get clicks with that story, but they're not reporting it, right? And New Brindley, we talked about this one prior when they were in the Health Finance Committee hearing House File 1, the abortion bill, and she's going down, breaking it down, all the late term abortion procedures and how gruesome they are, and demonstrating the necessity for that to be precluded in this law, and raising numerous other objections, the victimization of victims of sexual assault and human trafficking. And how does that get summarized by the Star Tribune? Well, State Representative Anu Brindley says this bill is extreme. One sentence that doesn't even begin to cover the depth of it. So you're right, Jeremy. I, I wasn't going to say negligence, but there's a better, like, malfeasance. Like, it's the conscientious choice to not do your job and or to do it poorly. That's what the mainstream media is guilty of. And I use the word guilty intentionally because it is a crime. Morally speaking, it is a crime for you to take on the mantle of being the people's eyes, ears, and voice, being in a position where you're supposed to speak truth to power, right? These are all the cliches that they toss at us and that they throw up as shields to uphold the veneer of virtue and nobility of their profession. Oh, we speak truth to power. No, you don't. You shield truth for power. That's what they're doing. You dilute truth for the sake of the powerful, whose laps you sit upon, right? That's what the press is. It is disgusting. And that's why we need this. That's why I spend time that probably that under other circumstances would be better spent actually working through the legislative process. But here's the thing, there's no point in me trying to work through the legislative process because the Democrats aren't going to listen. They have no interest in what the 40,000 Minnesotans who I represent have to say about anything. They don't care. The Democrats don't care about the 40,000 Minnesotans that I represent or the 40,000 Minnesotans a pop that every other Republican elected in the state of Minnesota care about. They don't care about those people's thoughts, their feelings, their values, their needs, their aspirations, their past, present, and future. They don't care about any of it. They don't care about them as people. They don't care about them as concepts. They don't care about the consequences to their lives. They don't care about their political enfranchisement. They don't care about their opinions, their rights. They don't care about any of it. For all practical purposes, every person who is not currently represented by a Democrat might as well not exist as far as the DFL is concerned. And
Well,
even within their own districts, the people who did not vote for them are worthless to them and mean nothing to them. And even the people who did vote for them, who might disagree to some extent or another on some of these most radical policies that they've been pushing through, are also completely disvalued. Their opinion does not count and will not be reflected in the final product here in St. Paul.
This reminds me of the tweet that you put out last week about the secession bill that I introduced last session.
Yeah.
Where you said, "Hey, remember when Munson introduced that bill to allow counties to secede to neighboring states? Remember how we all had a laugh? Maybe we need to dust off that plan." And that's, that was really the premise of that bill, was that if the Democrats in St. Paul are not listening to the concerns of rural Minnesotans, then maybe we should just choose better state government, right? It's about staying in your community, and just, if I could live under the laws of South Dakota or Iowa, I would be so much better off, right? I just went to Iowa last week for a few days, and there are billboards all over about school choice, right? They just passed groundbreaking the legislation we would die to have here, right? To just allow the money to follow the child. And I know that people in Minneapolis, St. Paul would love to have this too, that are suffering from terrible schools, spending $32,000 a student per year and still having failing grades. They have the legislation that we could work a lifetime for in Minnesota and still not obtain because of the Democrat stronghold on the metro. But if we could just pass a bill to allow the people to vote on whether or not we should allow rural counties to secede, and you know what? They should just go have at it, go join your other state, and take your worthless rocks and cows with you. We would love to, right? And it's making everybody happy. So I think the Democrats would actually support it and just let us go. But it's often a misunderstood bill.
Well, I would disagree with you on that last part. I don't think they want to let us go at all. I think for them, a huge part of everything that's going on right now is the same Schadenfreude that a bully experiences. It's about bullying. They are bullies. They love the fact that I have to show up here every day and rhetorically get beaten up and have my lunch money taken. They love that. They love the fact that there are millions of Minnesotans out there whose values are being trashed and ignored and marginalized and disenfranchised. They are giddy with pleasure over the idea. Look, I mean, go back and look at Finke's bill that's moving through committee to make this a sanctuary for the kidnapping, poisoning, and mutilation of children from other states. If anything, they want to reach their grasp out beyond the state lines of Minnesota and steal children, literally steal children from other states so that they can subject them to their corruption and perversion here in the state of Minnesota. There is no limit to the depth of their evil. And there's no way they would ever let one of their slaves go. They are Pharaoh.
Where do we go from here, man?
I don't know. I mean, that's the question I ask myself every day. What am I supposed to do now? Where am I supposed to turn next?
Yeah. I mean,
all we can do is point it out.
I offered a little criticism of the House GOP because it felt like they were laying down. And I know that the states, the Republicans in the Senate were also of that same mindset. In fact, it was, at a caucus where they were kind of like, this is the plan. We're going to do the same, 4 amendments that the House did and, get them on record of how they vote and it's going to pass. So there's kind of no sense in fighting. And, a certain conservative senator showed up with like 42 amendments. They were like, whoa, and of course in the Senate, you can offer amendments on the fly. You don't have to pre-file them. And you can just keep on offering additional ones on the floor. And they did. It went on for 12 hours. It was a grueling debate. But in the end, even after, compromising on amendments and changing them, the Democrats voted down every single amendment, 42 of them. I mean, it was just, or more than 40. It was ridiculous.
60 some.
Yeah, 60 some amendments. And so, it shows that they were not going to let that go to conference committee and have it come back to the House and Senate, and that there just was no compromise. I was texting one of the leading Democrats on the Senate floor about the bill because I know that was giving him heartburn having to vote for that bill, and he just texted back that oh, it just affirms people's right to make their healthcare decisions. Like, no, it doesn't. It's extreme. And you should be voting for some of these amendments that would offer, some guardrails on the bill. But
right.
Democrats fall in line, whereas Republicans have always been fractured in different divisions within our ranks. And so it's you just can't tell Republicans what to do like you can tell Democrats what to do.
Well, I think it goes deeper than that. I really do. Having had admittedly limited experience looking at it from the inside, what I see is more than just a difference in like temperament. It's not just that Democrats are a bunch of conformists and Republicans are more individualistic and more liable to go off on rogue-like or maverick directions. There's truth to that, but I think more fundamentally, what it comes down to is that Democrats and leftists constitutionally are imperialists. They are aristocrats. They are oligarchs. They believe in an institution of uniformity and solidarity. I mean, they even use that word, right? Solidarity. What does solidarity mean? In the way they apply the word, it means sacrificing your individual interest or even the interest of your group towards a broader, superior interest of an even larger group, a coalition. They believe in that. Our side, what we believe in constitutionally, is a deliberate and thoughtful analysis of the merit of an idea. And so the reason why you have Republicans who are more apt to go, this way or that on any given issue is because they're each actually thinking about the issue. And they each actually have the audacity to uh, believe that what they think as an individual about a given issue matters, and that what their interest group or the district or constituency that they represent, what they think actually should have some impact on the final result when it comes to the table. That's why this narrative that I heard when I was campaigning, and that candidates always hear whenever they campaign, this narrative of, well, why don't you guys just get along better? Why aren't you working across the aisle? Why aren't you compromising? You hear that from a lot of mainstream folks. And Republicans, we tend to respond to that favorably. Like, we hear people say that. Like, I had one of my big donors sat me and Eric Lucero down and gave us that lecture about how, like, you guys need to be willing to talk to the other side, and you need to be willing to compromise in order to get things done, and blah 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 blah. And you hear that as a Republican, as a conservative, and you think, that's reasonable. It's reasonable, the premise that I need to listen to the other side, and I need to weigh the merits of their argument and the strength of their position, and I might have to compromise a little bit in order to find middle ground. That's big. That's a reasonable premise onto itself, all other things being equal. But the left claim they'll buy that language for rhetorical and marketing purposes to sell you on, quote unquote, one Minnesota. And they'll tell you that that's what one Minnesota means, but they don't actually believe it at all. What they believe, and what is very evident by how they've conducted themselves during this legislative session, is that he who wins makes the rules and owes nothing to he who lost. Nothing. Those in charge are masters of those who are not. That's what they believe. That's what they want. That's what the design of their policies is all about. Furthering that. This is the American Revolution playing out over and over again through the adjudication of American politics, and certainly the adjudication of politics in Minnesota. The Democrats believe that it should be one Minnesota in the most authoritarian, statist sense of the term. That one idea of how things ought to be should be imposed upon all of Minnesota. That's what they believe. And that's what they're doing. And that's why their members fall in line. That's why even when we were debating the abortion bill on the floor of the House, and we forced them through parliamentary maneuver to have to vote on third trimester abortion, when we actually got 4 of their people to break off and come to us for a little bit, and then one of them was strong-armed to switch her vote so that the amendment wouldn't be adopted. And she ended up crying in the back room, in the retiring room, from the stress of it all and the trauma of it all. That's why that happened, because they cannot allow. That's why, I'll tell you another story. This is how petty it is, okay? This is how petty their insistence upon not taking anything that we offer has become. Yesterday in Public Safety Committee, Representative Brad Tabke presented a bill that was heard, that was the effect of it. It was a relatively minor thing that doesn't really matter, which just emphasizes the point that I'm trying to make. They wanted to change the position of ombudsman for corrections, which is like a position that kind of is supposed to independently investigate accusations of misconduct within the Department of Corrections. Under current state law, that position serves at the pleasure of the governor, meaning that the governor can appoint and fire that person for any reason at any time. So Tabke's bill was to change that. So instead of serving at the pleasure of the governor, the ombudsman had to be removed for just cause, insert a just cause standard into there. And so Paul Novotny, the Republican lead on the Public Safety Committee, submitted an amendment. And what the amendment was going to do is it was going to put in there that the governor may appoint, with the advice and consent of the Senate, the ombudsman for the corrections. And so what that would do is mean that yeah, we can get rid of the ombudsman for just cause, but you're also going to have to get the input of the legislature in order to put a new person in there. Now, this is actually 100% in alignment with the stated intent of Tabke's bill, because the justification provided, the entire argument offered for why we need to make this change in the process, is so that the ombudsman is, the independence of the office is insulated from the political whims to which a governor is subject. Okay, so as we're debating this amendment, and as Tapke's saying, I don't want it, I reject it, I'm asking him, dude, you're saying you want to insulate the ombudsman from political whim. What we're suggesting is we want to help you do that, so that not only is it subject to the judgment of the governor, but it's also subject to the judgment of 60 some odd senators who get to provide their advice and consent. Don't you see that that's going to further insulate this position from the political whims that you're so concerned about? His answer was, not as I see it. Now, he had to answer that way because he couldn't argue my point, because obviously I'm correct, right? Like, obviously our amendment furthers his stated goal. I left him with no argument but that's the only argument he was left with, and it's the argument he gave simply because they cannot allow us to have any sort of impact or influence. They don't want us to have our fingerprint on anything that they are doing, even if it furthers their stated goal. That's how partisan this session is.
Well, and it's certainly, I mean, it's always been partisan. It may be extreme. You're seeing stuff up close now, but if you, Walter, have a really good idea, a really good bill, and you introduce it, and you even get some Democrats to sign on to it, which is rare, but you might get it, you'll find that your bill won't actually become law. The Democrats will clone your bill, reintroduce it, give it to a freshman so that it's their idea, their bill. They'll carry it forward and bring it into law. I mean, I saw that, my first session in, and it was disheartening, but you learn that you don't have to get credit to get it done. But to just not accept an amendment like that, it's ridiculous, it's petty, and it shows that they're not working across the aisle. One of the things that I look forward to, of course, when you're in the minority, you find that omnibus bills are horrible, right? You hate them because everything gets crammed through. You go to committee and you find that you don't get to vote on most stuff because it gets laid over for possible inclusion in the committee's omnibus bill. So no one gets on record on how they're going to support that individual bill. And then all of a sudden at the end of session, an omnibus bill comes through with 100 or 200 bills rolled into one. You get one vote up or down. You'll offer a bunch of amendments. It'll all get stricken down. One of the biggest critics of omnibus bills on the left is Senator Marty. And he just took over the reins from Julie Rosen, who was like the master of omnibus bills on the right. And he's a critic of omnibus bills. Now he's in charge of the Senate Finance Committee, where all of these bills go at the end. And he's actually, so far sticking to his guns a little bit on his hatred of omnibus bills. One of the criticisms, should be bipartisan criticism, is that if you have an omnibus finance bill, you shouldn't be able to stick policy in that bill. But, the Republicans and Democrats have been doing it. The last 20 years, the omnibus bills have grown to be so huge that and they violate the single subject clause, the requirement of our Constitution that bills be a single subject. I am looking forward to seeing if he actually sticks to his guns or if he caves under the pressure from leadership to get some of this stuff crammed through in these massive bills. But he's been written up in the last week about his unwillingness to cram both policy and finance together in bills. That may be a good thing. That hopefully will break things up so we get more votes and more accountability and more transparency from the public. But you're right. Everything is very hyper partisan at the legislature. And, with them having full control of everything, they don't need Republicans. I argued at the beginning, you guys should just not even show up for work. Go in. You saw there were, 50 amendments struck down by the Democrats in a single session. They didn't take a single amendment from the Republicans. Maybe now you should just not show up for 2 weeks and just, report out to the media that They're obviously not even willing to work with Republicans. They're not accepting any amendments. What's the point? Let's just save the taxpayers some per diems and stay home.
Yeah, it's not a terrible idea. It really isn't. And at what the one thing, I mean, we would have to think it through, but the one surefire positive is it would at least force the media to pay attention and ask why. Now, they're going to breathlessly report whatever narrative the DFL feeds them as to why we're doing it and what it's really about, and our message will get lost and won't actually get out. That's how it'll end up happening or playing out. But it would at the very least highlight that there's some degree of dysfunction taking place down here. Yeah, it's not a terrible idea on its face.
Well, we'll probably talk about omnibus bills more on the Omnibus podcast. But for those listening, if you're really interested in learning more about the legislation that's going on, what happened in the last session too, the Legislative Evaluation Assembly, the LEA, is having their annual banquet on February 21st. It's a great gathering of conservatives. It's going to happen in, let me just see that, Mounds View at the Mermaid Event Center on February 21st. It's in the evening. Dinner at 6:30. Program starts at 7. The featured speakers are Kendall and Sheila Qualls, and they're going to be talking about the subversion of quality education in Minnesota. It's going to be a great speech, and of course, we're going to be giving awards to 5 fine legislators from last session, including yours truly. Next year, we hope to see Walter Hudson on the list of honorees. But come down and meet. You guys can join the LEA for like $10 a year, but it helps with the annual scorecard. And the LEA scorecard is the best scorecard out there for conservatives that show if you support limited government, fiscal responsibility, fiscal restraint. It's a great, but come on down to the LEA. You can go out to the website, lea-mn.org to learn more. And it's just a faithless plug for an organization that I've really supported and love their scorecard to understand how the legislators are voting, what bills were most important in the last session, and kind of how to separate the wheat from the chaff. Because in this session, where the Republicans are in the minority in both chambers, it's easy for Republicans to vote no on everything. But as you get towards the end of session, you'll see how conservatives are slipping in either legislation or voting. And these are important votes to track.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of the LEA. I'm curious to see how things pan out over the course of this session. I, for one, do not take into consideration scoring or how I imagine different entities, friendly or otherwise, are going to score a bill. I'm looking at a bill on its merits. But that makes it all the more interesting to find out, what my temperature really is, so to speak. So.
Yeah. I mean, when we were in the majority, it was very prevalent in the caucus room where, leaders would actually stand up and say, the Chamber of Commerce wants this, and, the chamber is going to be scoring it. And if you want their help in the election next session, you better vote for this bill, or the NFIB or whoever. I mean, they throw these organizations out there that's their bill, that's their legislation. In fact, when you're in the majority, I would say at least half of the bills that are introduced were written by lobbyists or their organizations, and they go around and find their legislators that they support and say, hey, we need these 3 bills introduced, or we need permission to go up and meet the revisers so we can draft a bill for you. And they have a lot of influence. Of course, in the minority, less so, but you'll see the pressures from these organizations in the end of session. And of course, we saw it with the driver's license for all bill, since the chamber really wants driver's licenses. And we heard a lot of Republicans stand up and say that, oh, if you just change this bill to have not for voting purposes on the back of the driver's license, then you'd get a lot of support from the Republican side of the aisle, which, infuriates me, because it's not just about voting, right? We don't have voter ID in the state, but it's about continuing to allow, tens of thousands of people take jobs from lower income Minnesotans, and people that don't have permission to be in this country. And we're just continuing to stand up and openly talk about how many people are here, and let's help them get to these jobs that they shouldn't have. that they shouldn't be taking from Minnesotans.
Yeah, it's definitely a narrative that was not fully explored in terms of like, and that's really the thing that annoys me the most is that there's a whole side of the equation on a lot of these issues that's just never addressed, and it's usually the victim, right? It's the victim who doesn't merit enough political value to be mentioned, whether it's the victim of a crime whose perpetrator we're now arguing about how sad his life is, that he's burdened with conviction and the loss of privileges that come with that, or it's the low income Minnesotan whose job has been displaced by someone who has no legal right to be here, and we're more concerned about how hard it is to be here illegally than it is than we are with the life of the Minnesotan who ought to be able to have access to the opportunities that's been displaced from them. There's always some person, it's always a person who's being erased, overlooked, de-emphasized, marginalized. And that's something that we need to continue to be on the lookout for.
Yeah. Last, I'd like to bring up a small bill that you're going to be voting on. 2 years ago, we had special sessions every month. So we came in June, and we were there for Juneteenth, where is a celebration where slaves in Texas found out way after the fact that they were free. And so they celebrate in Texas June 17th as a recognition of the end of slavery. For some reason, other states have enacted state holidays to celebrate Juneteenth. And as a Republican, of course, our history of fighting against slavery, fighting for emancipation, I stood up on the House floor after the Democrats voted to keep the state in purchasing solar panels that were made by slaves in China that were in an internment camp. I said it's been 156 years and Republicans are still fighting against the Democrat support for slavery. I don't mind Juneteenth being a holiday. I think especially if we look at the history of our political parties' involvement in slavery, the Democrats' involvement in slavery and the Republicans' involvement in emancipating slaves. But I don't understand why we need to have that holiday in Minnesota when we had nothing to do with slavery other than fighting against it. But this late recognition of freedom that they celebrate in Texas seems like an odd holiday. And of course, it's just another holiday for all state workers, teachers, I'm sure schools, everything else to be closed. What are your thoughts on creating an official holiday here in the state of Minnesota?
Well, my understanding is that this is already established in Minnesota, and that this bill is largely a technical bill just to adjust the actual date upon which it's recognized, and that my understanding, and I haven't looked at it, so I can't say definitively, but my understanding of the bill is that it's a largely technical bill that they're putting forward probably as some pretense to sit around on the floor for half an hour and beat their chests about how sensitive they are to the needs of minorities. But in reality, it has no actual effect on anything at all because this is already a paid holiday for state employees. So,
okay. I didn't know it was a paid holiday already.
Yeah, that's my understanding, according to because it's perhaps not by statute, but according to like their union contracts. So it doesn't change anything in practical terms for people on the ground, as far as I understand it.
Okay, well, it'll be an interesting debate, or maybe not. Maybe it'll just be a simple.
It shouldn't be an interesting debate, is what I'm saying, but it may be. So we'll find out.
Well, I know that in the Senate, when they passed this in the Senate, there was quite a debate about usually when you pass a bill at the state, this may not have a major fiscal impact, but making it a official holiday for the state may have impact in local government, right? Counties, board members, schools, and everything else. And so if this is what they're pushing, understanding what the fiscal cost is for local governments and ignoring that is going to be, I guess, something worth debating on the floor. But yeah,
I'll take a look at it before it comes to the floor. But from what I've been told, it's not that big of a deal. But I guess we'll see.
Okay. All right, Walter. Well, thanks for spending another hour with us at the Omnibus Podcast. Thanks to the listeners. Of course, if you haven't already, go out and sign up for Walter Hudson's legislative update so you can hear more about the details of bills that are coming through committee that he's on. And look forward to having you back next week, Walter, for another discussion here on the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane.